Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, an apology for Elizabethan manners from Il Galateo. The manners of the court of Queen Elizabeth I are a difficult thing for most modern Magonomia players, because our various countries now see them, rightly, as repressive. Why this is varies a little. I'm an Australian, and the manners that they are using were, for a long time, used as a racial marker to separate the rulers, the English and perhaps Scots, from the rest of us. Here I'm using race in the historical English sense. In my country, Italians, Greeks and Spaniards were not legally considered white until after the Second World War. Well, modern ones, Alexander, Julius Caesar, Jesus, they were all sort of grandfathered in. As for America, I've only visited briefly, but I consume many of its cultural products, and it seems to me that de Tocqueville was onto something when he said that Americans made it difficult for him by formally professing equality and then getting quite annoyed if you couldn't tell who was in charge in the room. Elizabethans don't do this. Indeed, they think that formidable people who take humility past the point of making life difficult for other people are rude. Over at LibriVox, a pack of us have been recording one of the most popular courtesy books in Elizabeth's court. It was published mid-reign in Venice and was rapidly translated. In future weeks, I'll share examples of poor etiquette so you can add them to your characters, particularly NPCs. This week, though, I thought I'd share the insider's view on why they thought elaborate etiquette was good and moral. It's one of the few apologies I've seen which is from the time and tries to sincerely make the point. And now, over to a slightly younger version of myself. Introduction. As you are now just entering upon the journey of life, which I, as you see, have already in a great measure performed, I determined with myself, from the sincere affection which I bear you, to point out some few dangerous parts of the road where, from my own experience, I had the most reason to apprehend you might either fatally err, or at least, in some respect, deviate from the right track, that, by the assistance of my instructions, you might persevere in a right course, with safety to yourself, and with credit to your illustrious family. But as you may be incapable, at so early a period of life, to comprehend the force of any more abstruse and more weighty instructions, I shall reserve everything of that kind to a more proper season, and confine myself at present to those things which perhaps to some people may appear trifling and frivolous, namely, by what kind of conduct, in his familiar intercourse with the rest of mankind, any one may acquire the character of a well-bred, amiable, and polite man, politeness being in itself, if not really a virtue, yet so nearly resembling a virtue as hardly to be distinguished from it. For though it is certainly more laudable, and a thing of greater moment, to be generous, constant, and magnanimous, than merely to be polite and well-bred, yet we find from daily experience that sweetness of manners, a genteel carriage, and polite address are frequently of more advantage to those who are so happy as to be possessed of them, than any greatness of soul or brightness of parts are to those who are adorned by those more shining talents. For those slighter accomplishments are far more frequent, or rather of constant and daily use on every occasion, as we are under a necessity of conversing daily with other people, whereas justice, fortitude, and those other more exalted virtues are of a much less frequent occurrence, for neither is a generous or a brave man obliged to exhibit those virtues every hour of the day, which indeed would be impossible. Neither has a wise man, or a man of great genius, an opportunity of displaying those extraordinary talents, but very rarely. As much, therefore, as those greater qualities exceed those more trifling accomplishments in weight and importance, so much the latter exceed the former in number and more frequent use. Now, if it were decent or proper, I could mention by name many persons within our knowledge, who, though in other respects men of no extraordinary merit, yet have been greatly caressed through life on no other account than from an easy and agreeable behaviour in their common intercourse with mankind, by the help of which, however, they have raised themselves to the highest dignities, leaving at a great distance behind them those who have infinitely excelled them in those more noble and exalted virtues above mentioned. For as an amiable and ingenuous behaviour has a great influence in conciliating the favour of those with whom we converse, so, on the contrary, a morose and disgusting behaviour will certainly excite their hatred and contempt. Wherefore, though a disagreeable rusticity of manners be not punishable by those laws of any community, as being indeed but a slight offence, yet we see nature herself chastises our failure in this respect with sufficient asperity, as on this account we are evidently deprived of the company and the favourable opinion of mankind, and certainly as other more heinous crimes are attended with more real detriment, so these slighter offences bring with them a greater variety, or at least more frequent inconveniences. For in like manner, as men who consider wild beasts as objects of terror, and disdain to show any dread of such minute animals as gnats or flies, yet on account of the continued trouble which those teasing insects occasion, are more frequently put out of humour by them than by those more bulky creatures, so it usually happens that the generality of mankind are infinitely more distressed by those rustic and untractable mortals than by men of more notoriously flagitious characters. It is not to be disputed, then, that every man who is not determined to spend his life in solitude and the retreat of an hermitage, but in the company and assemblies of the polite, must think it of the utmost consequence to make himself amiable and agreeable in conversation. Not to mention that those other virtues of generosity and munificence require a splendid fortune, a table, and equipage to exhibit them to advantage, without which they are of little or no importance, whereas this elegance of manners, which depends entirely on our words and actions, even without the appendage of a good estate, gives a man influence and the appearance of a gentleman. Now that you may the more successfully discharge your duty in this respect, you must observe that you ought to regulate your manner of behaviour towards others, not according to your own humour, but agreeably to the pleasure and inclination of those with whom you converse, to which it is entirely, yet under certain restrictions, to be directed. For he who in the common intercourse with his acquaintance conforms with a boundless obsequiousness to the will of others, such a one must be deemed a mere parasite, a scaramouche, or a buffoon, rather than a well-bred man or a gentleman. As on the contrary, he who is quite careless and indifferent, whether he pleases or displeases his company, is deservedly esteemed a rude, ill-bred, clownish fellow. As, therefore, when we consult not our own pleasures, but that of our friends, our behaviour will be pleasing and agreeable, our first inquiry must be what those particulars are with which the greatest part of mankind are universally delighted, and what those are which, in general, they detest as troublesome and offensive. For thus we shall easily discover what kind of conduct in our intercourse with others is to be avoided, and what to be adopted and pursued. A general view of the subject. It is to be observed, then, that whatever is offensive or disagreeable to any one of our senses, or contrary to our natural instincts and desires, and further, whatever raises in our minds an idea of anything filthy or indecent, or what shocks our understanding, I say that everything and every action of this kind, as being greatly displeasing to others, is carefully to be avoided. Nothing, therefore, either filthy or immodest, nauseous or disgusting, ought not only to be done but even mentioned in the presence of others. Nor is it only the acting or mentioning of anything of this kind that is generally displeasing, but even the representing them by an emotion or gesture to the imagination of another is extremely offensive. End of part 1. Your saga may vary.